Sevgili konuklar, Loca'daki konuklarımız ve YouTube kanalımızdan şu anda bizi izleyen izleyicilerimiz, hepiniz hoş geldiniz. Ben Yapı Kredi Kültür Sanat Yayıncılık Etkinlikler Yöneticisi Ahsen Erdoğan. Bu akşam Loca'da YKY'nin değerli yazarı Profesör Lea Ypi'yi ağırlıyoruz. Ypi 28 Haziran 3 Temmuz tarihleri arasında Kadir Has Üniversitesi'nde gerçekleşen Uluslararası Hukuk Felsefesi ve Sosyal Felsefe Birliği'nin 32. Dünya Kongresi kapsamında bu sabah Ahlaki Sosyalizm başlıklı bir bildiri sundu. Şimdi de kitaplar üzerine konuşmak üzere burada aramızda. Türkiye'deki okurlar Ypi'yi ilk kez Özgür, Şey Parçalanırken Büyümek kitabıyla tanıdı. İlknur Özdemir'in çevirisiyle dile kazandırılan bu kitapta Ypi, doğup büyüdüğü Arnavutluğun komünist dönemiyle bugününü karşılaştırıyor ve hangisi daha gerçek, hangisi daha özgür sorularını soruyordu. Daha özgür ve daha sahici olmak üzere toplumsal ve siyasal düzenlerin yıkılıp yeniden kurulduğu dünyamızda ve dahi kişisel evrenimizde, kişisel yaşamlarımızda bizler, bireyler ve toplumlar olarak sahiden özgür müyüz sorusunu sorduğumuzda ulaştığımız cevaplar Lea Ypi'nin kitabındakiler kadar can yakıcı olabiliyor. Bu nedenle kitapla çok kolay ilişki kurabildi Türkiye'deki okurlar. Ypi'nin ikinci kitabı Haysiyetsizlik, Yeniden Biçimlendirilen Bir Hayat, bu ayın başında yine Yapı Kredi yayınlarından yayımlandı ve yine İlknur Özdemir'in harika çevirisiyle sizlerle buluştu. Ypi bu kez hayatı boyunca nezaketine ve bilgeliğine sığındığı ama tek bir kare fotoğraf yüzünden sosyal medyada lince uğrayan babaannesi Leman'ın ve ailesinin onurunu kurtarmak için geçmişin karanlık dehlizlerine daldı bu kitapta. Bu kitap arşivlerin soğuk belgeleriyle anıların sıcaklığını harmanlayarak bir hayatı yeniden kurguluyor. Ypi'nin bu akşam Loca'da Ebru Dedeoğlu ile yapacağı sohbet daha çok bu ikinci kitaba odaklanacak. Lea Ypi, Arnavut asıllı siyaset bilimci ve yazardır. 1979 yılında Tiran'da dünyaya geldi. London School of Economics'te siyaset teorisi profesörü olarak görev yapmaktadır. Enver Hoca rejimi altında çocukluğunu geçiren Ypi, Arnavutluk'taki komünizmin çöküşünü ve vahşi kapitalizme geçiş sürecini anlattığı Özgür, Şey Parçalanırken Büyümek adlı anı kitabıyla dünya çapında tanındı. Ebru Dedeoğlu Doğan Kitap'ta pazarlama bölümünde çalıştı. Gazete Oksijen ve T24'te edebiyat, yayıncılık gibi kültür sanat alanlarında söyleşileri yayımlanıyor. Sözü Ypi ve Dedeoğlu'na bırakıyorum. Söyleşinin sonunda kısa bir soru cevap bölümü olacak. Kitap imzalatmak isteyenler de yine söyleşinin ardından burada bizlerle buluşabilirler. İyi akşamlar dilerim.
Teşekkürler. Herkese merhaba, hoş geldiniz. Ben Ebru Dedeoğlu. Gazete Oksijen ve T24'te röportajlar yapıyorum. Lea Ypi'yi uzun zamandır takip ediyordum ama burada tanışmak benim için büyük bir heyecan ve gurur oldu. Hem ailemin geçmişinde ortak bir geçmiş olduğu için hem de kişisel tarih üzerinden, gündelik hayatın tarihi üzerinden bir Balkan tarihini, Osmanlı İmparatorluğu'nda başlayan komünizmden faşizme ve Balkanların tekrardan kurulma sürecini okumak beni ve bilmediğim konuları keşfetmek beni tekrar düşünmeye sevk etti. Aslında kitap şöyle bir soruyla başlıyor. Tek bir fotoğraf bir insanın bütün hayatını değiştirebilir mi? Aslında bunu birebir kendimizle düşündüğümüz zaman bu sorunun karşılığını vermek çok zor. Çünkü sosyal medya çağındayız ve bu her türlü linçe neden olabiliyor. Ama Lea Ypi bu soruyla başlayan kitabında tarafsızca, duygularından arınmış bir şekilde araştırmaya başlıyor ve babaannesi Leman ve eşi Aslan'ın o balayı fotoğraflarından çıkarak belgelere, arşivlere ve anılara dayanarak bir geçmişi bize anlatıyor. Hoş geldin Lea.
Thank you. Thank you very much for hosting me.
Thank you. Sorularıma başlarken şöyle başlamak istiyorum. Haysiyetsizlik, Kant'ın her şeyin bir bedeli vardır ya da bir değeri sözüyle açılıyor. Leman'ın hayatında da insanlar bazen devlet için, bazen ideolojiler için ve tarih için bir araç haline geliyor. Bu kitap Kant'ın sözlerini doğruluyor mu Leman'ın hayatını düşündüğümüzde?
Thank you very much. It's in a way the challenge of the book to answer this question of whether the indignity that she is exposed to throughout her life manages in the end to crush this thing that we all human beings have inside us that makes us resist even the hardest circumstances and reject the compromises that seem to undermine our moral integrity. And so this book starts with a character that is both real and unreal. It's real because it's a woman that I know and that I loved and a member of my family. It's real because her life experiences are real and because the tragedies that the book narrates are the real world tragedies that affected that life and that of members of her family. But it's also in some ways unreal in the sense of idealized, because she's also a model of virtue, a model of something that we would like to see in the world when everything goes against us. We would like to see someone who tries, however hard it is, to cling on to their humanity and to cling on to this concept of dignity that shapes the book. That it's a book is in many ways a family history, and it's a family history about real characters. But in another way, it's also a philosophical investigation on what dignity means, what it means to make moral choices in this time of extremes, what it means to ask this question of moral choices when your own time is a time of extremes and you reach back to these models of the past, of our grandparents, of ancestors, of these mythical characters that are real but also constructed in our imagination, because we want to have a counterexample of how things could be if we were to make these moral decisions and to reject this, to refuse these compromises. And I don't know if the book resolves this tension and this dilemma, because it shows on the one hand that yes, there is a struggle, and it's really hard when there is that struggle to actually maintain your dignity. But on the other hand, it also shows how important it is to hold on to this idea regardless of the struggle. And there's the narrator, the author, me, who wants to believe that this woman did manage to keep her dignity and did manage to hold on to the struggle regardless of everything else. And she needs that not just to return the dignity to the grandmother, but she also needs it for her own purposes, for the time in which she lives, that is the time in which we live and the author lives, to hold on to this idea, because it's a kind of idea that we need in the present as much as in thinking about the past.
Peki bir ara soru sormak istiyorum. Tarafsızlığını nasıl korudun? Hani sonuçta anneannen, deden, tüm aile hikayen var burada. Ve orada o belgeleri araştırırken, anılara ulaşırken ki kitapta arşiv görevlisiyle olan diyalogların gerçekten çok güzel ve bazı yerlerde çok güldüm hatta. Çünkü Türkiye'de de aynı standartlarla karşılaşabiliyorsun. Tarafsızlığını nasıl korudun? Ya da koruyabildin mi?
Yes, I think I tried to, because I didn't want to write a book only from the point of view of a family member. And in a way, I think just like the archive, just like historical memory has its biases, family also has biases, and family also has myths, and family also has creatures of the imagination that people need to go back, and they want to think of their ancestors in a certain way. And I think family comes with its own biases. But it was very important to me to write a book that wasn't just about my family, that because of the question of dignity, that tries to present this woman not just as a member of the family and not just as a relation between the granddaughter and the grandmother, as a personal relation, but also as a model of virtue that goes beyond this family relation. And in that sense, it was important not to write just from the perspective of the family member, with all the good and the bad that comes with it. Because I think family gives us affection, but it also gives us the burden of guilt on behalf of someone who doesn't live anymore. And in the case of my book, a lot of the story starts with going to these Secret Service communist era archives, where most people who go there think that they are going to find heroes, but often what they find is not heroes, is people who are complicit with a dictatorial regime that survives on the complicity of ordinary people. I think no tyrannical regime would survive just with the power of the dictator or with a tyrant. It needs the everyday compliance and complicity of ordinary people. And so I was very prepared for the fact that even though I was very close to my grandmother and I had a very good memory of her and I had her in my mind as a paragon of virtue, that I would enter the archive and I would discover that the woman that I thought was a victim of the system and a model of how to resist, in fact, in reality, might turn out to be a collaborator and someone who is just as complicit as everyone else. And because I was prepared for that, when I went to the archive, I decided to enter it as a researcher and to tell the story with everything that I would find in it, with the good and the bad, regardless of this difficulty. In the end, it turned out not to be the case, or at least in the documents that I read, nothing showed up that presented her differently from how I knew her. There are parts that I didn't know of her life, but nothing changed this moral evaluation. But because I was prepared for this moral evaluation, I needed the distance that comes with saying, I'm a researcher, I'm constructing this from a more general perspective. I need the kind of impartiality that comes with leaving these family bonds to one side and then entering as someone who is trying to tell a more general story for the reader. But of course, I also wanted to hang on to the individual that I knew, because a story isn't just a story about general universal ideas and philosophical ideas, it's also the story of a real life. And so family gives you that. So in that sense, I would say that the book is an effort that moves between family and family history and burdens of family on the one hand, and philosophical analysis and more abstract reflection on this moral concept of dignity. And it's in this balancing act that you find this impartiality that still comes from a partial perspective.
Kitaptaki zaten tarafsızlık tarafı çok etkileyiciydi. Bir de gündelik hayatla, oradaki karakterlerin yaşam tarihiyle, yaşamda geçirdiği vakitlerle ve anlattıklarıyla biz koca bir Balkanları ve büyük bir dönüşümü beraber yaşadık ve okuyoruz. Birçoğumuzun hiç bilmediği konularda özellikle Enver Hoca ve diğer savaş, işte faşizme geçilmesi, komünizmden faşizme geçilmesi dönemini çok etkileyici buldum o yüzden ve orada tamamıyla da çok cesurca tarafsızlığın üzerinden gitmişsin. Tam da bu noktada şeyi sormak istiyorum. Haysiyetsizlik nedir? Daha önce de konuştuk bu konuyu ama hep haysiyet üzerinden gidiyoruz. Bu sefer haysiyetsizlik nedir sana sormak istiyorum.
Thank you. Yeah, so in a way, the word indignity actually only occurs once in the whole book. And it's only once in the very final sentence. So it's in the title, and then it's once in the whole book, and it's the final sentence which says that it's indignity that is defied through the imagination. Because indignity doesn't need to be named. It's always there. And so what is constantly named in the book is dignity. What is dignity? This effort that we make to hang on to our moral agency, to being responsible people, to taking responsibility for others, to live through and on behalf of our commitments, even though it's really, really hard. But this search for dignity is there all the time, and it needs to be mentioned all the time. There is different conceptions of dignity. There is a more Kantian conception, there is a Stoic conception, there is a fascist conception of dignity, a nationalist, a socialist, a liberal. So all these different projects, both in the individual and at the collective level, about dignity, that try to give a meaning to this word of dignity. This is part of all the dialogues and the plot and the character construction. There's even a Nietzschean anti-dignity character who wants to show that actually there is no dignity, that morality is just a result of power exercise. But for this reason, dignity is always there and it's always mentioned and named as dignity, because we need the name when we don't see the quality. You need the concept when you're not exposed to it. And indignity doesn't need to be named because it's always there. The world is from the beginning a world of indignity, and the indignity shows itself in all these different projects that appropriate dignity but actually don't live up to it. Because in the end, they all, for one reason or another, sacrifice humanity and make compromises and make choices and find ways of justifying the violation of dignity by saying, oh, but the others are also doing it, or but the circumstances are such, or the political situation requires it, or we need to make these terrible decisions. And they know that what it costs. They know that they are sacrificing it, but they are justifying it. And I think this is the world that my characters live in, but I also think it's the world in which we live in, where you find dignity mentioned everywhere in all the human rights documents, in all the legal constitutional documents, in all the founding political acts of the different states that we know. But we also see that all the time our political leaders, political choices, everything that happens in society shows us the opposite of dignity. And so we live in dignity, but we need to name dignity, which is why it's only mentioned once in a negative, to say that literature and art may be the only thing that we have to defeat this indignity in which we live and that surrounds us.
Ki şu anda yaşadığımız dünyada çok benzer örnekler görüyoruz. Aslında aynı şeyleri yaşıyoruz. Çok da farklı değil bence. Şu an özellikle bulunduğumuz tüm dünya ekonomisi ve dünya savaşlarını düşünecek olursak yönetimleri. O zaman şöyle bir soru sormak istiyorum. Kahramanlık ile haysiyet arasında ne fark var?
I wonder whether heroism is what we need to see dignity embodied in people. And so the hero is the subject that leads a dignified life. But I also think that, as a matter of fact, in the real world, and this is also part of the moral ambiguity in which my book lives, heroes are often not in the real world. Even historical heroes, even the heroes that we think are heroes, are actually heroes that we make because we have a need for sense and for recognizing dignity in people and for connecting it to these particular exemplars of virtue. So I think of the heroes and of heroism as the subjective manifestation of this abstract quality of dignity and moral agency and this abstract philosophical property that lives in a character, and that's a heroism. But I also think, and this is why the book is a hybrid between fiction and non-fiction, that the character is constructed, and it's constructed out of the need that the author and the reader have for sense, for something not to be absurd. Because in the real world, even in the case of my grandmother, you see the effort to preserve dignity, but you also see how hard it is. When you put yourself in her situation and ask yourself, would I have made these choices? Did I make these compromises? You often are not sure whether that is an example of heroism or if it's something completely different. And we call it heroism after, especially when someone is dead, usually. Because at the end of a life, that's when we ascribe a meaning to this life. And the meaning that we ascribe is, I think, for our meaning-making purposes, as much as adherence to the truth of the situation or of the character or of the person. And so that's why I think, even in the case of my grandmother, she's as much a real presence and influence in my life as the need of an author's imagination to share an example of heroism with the readers to help them navigate the difficulties and the complexities of the time in which they live.
Evet, ama Leman karakteri, yani babaanneniz, çok güçlü bir karakter. Leman çok genç yaşında Arnavutluğa tek başına gidiyor, tek başına büyük bir mücadele veriyor, sevdiği adamı buluyor ve büyük işler başarıyor. Aslında çok feminist bir hareket bir anlamda da. Feminist bir kadın olarak ben öngörüyorum. O dönemde bu kitabı, o dönemi de düşünecek olursak, genç bir kadının özgürleşme hikayesi olarak okumamız gerekmiyor mu? Kahramanlık hikayesinden ayrı olarak.
Yes, absolutely. And I think it's absolutely that. And it is someone who is very young and resists the pressures of the time. So she's a woman in a men's environment, but she goes to Albania by herself. She goes to Albania because in Greece she's told that she's an Albanian, even though she has never been to Albania. And you have these identitarian pressures of the 20th century, and in particular the rise of the nation state that imposes these identities on these post-imperial subjects who would have had a completely different identity in a different political configuration. But there she is. Greece has become, or Salonika has become part of Greece. She's born in Salonika. Salonika is increasingly becoming a Greek city. She's Albanian, she doesn't quite belong, so she's told that her home is Albania, and she decides to appropriate this home and to exercise this act of rebellion, to leave behind her family, to go to Albania by herself at the age of 18, without knowing anyone, without having any connections there. She's already very emancipated in school. She's smoking her first cigar at the age of 14, and she's hanging out with political Jewish people, Greeks, and in these radical circles that try to resist these forces.
Ki çok da yargılanıyor.
Emerge.
Anladım.
Say again?
Çok da yargılanıyor
She,
çevresi tarafından.
yes, she's judged, and she fights against that. She has this aunt that I write about in the very beginning, Aunt Selma, who is like her, who is a model for her. She's very emancipated. She reads the French Revolution and worries about women and after the French Revolution. And she reads Madame de Staël, and she says she prefers to read Madame de Staël to Madame Bovary, and that women shouldn't be complaining but should just take their fate in their own hands. So in that sense, I think she is a feminist hero and pioneer, and an example of how being a victim of patriarchy doesn't necessarily consign you to adopting the position of the victim. You can resist, and you can respond, and you can try to actually take your fate in your own hands. But what is also very important for the book is that this story of this woman, and in particular this part of the story, this rebelliousness and this resistance, and the fact that this is manifested throughout her life, this is something that is not captured in the archives. This is not the story of women that lives in the historical records. And it's not something that you find in the Secret Service archives, this dimension of her life. It's not something that I found when I went to Italy to research her life. I was always being told, but look, women are not even juridical subjects in Italy, so it's very hard to find records on women. You have to look for the husband or the uncle or the brother, and there is no evidence because they don't exist in the archive. And so this, writing the story of a woman from this agency perspective, from the perspective of someone who resisted the status of victim and lived her life trying to show that even though others thought she was a victim, in fact she was not. She tried to resist that. This is something that needs literature to be told, and needs the imagination, and needs an author's telling the story in a particular way, through these role models that disappear on the archive, through the books that she read, through the kinds of documents that she was constantly appropriating and elaborating herself for her own purposes, through her family dynamics. And this is the only way in which you could have this dimension of her story in the book, is through literature, and by, in particular, focusing explicitly on this aspect, often at the expense of what is in the archive.
Tabii ki. Evet. Leman'ın halasına gelmek istiyorum, Selma. Benim en çok etkilendiğim karakter. Selma genç yaşta hayatına evlenecek üzereyken, çok da vermek istemiyorum, tüyo vermek istemiyorum. Hayatına son veriyor. Özgürlük adına ya da kendi inandığı karar doğrultusunda bu seçimi yapıyor. Selma ile Leman arasında bir benzeşlik kurabilir miyiz? Birbirlerinin, yani daha doğrusu Selma Leman'ın rol modeli olmuş olabilir mi? Çünkü aynı benzer özgürlük duygularına sahipler. Belki sende de vardır.
Yes, absolutely. They are absolutely connected, and they are connected in her mind, in her memories, in her stories of her life in Salonika and of her family story before, but they were also connected in the way in which she thought about duty and morality and reason, and the fact that for both Selma and her, there is this idea of dignity as something that belongs to rational beings, that is not about following your passions or your inclinations or your interests, but asking yourself if they are reasonable. But there is an important difference, and this is where Selma in the book is an example of dignity, but from a slightly different perspective from Leman. So they share this idea that dignity is found in freedom, and that freedom has this moral dimension that requires you to somehow extricate yourself from nature. But Selma takes that literally. At the point in which her dignity is undermined, or she thinks her dignity is sacrificed, I don't want to say what she does, but what she does is to respond in a way that takes her away from this web of relations and responsibilities and leaves Leman wondering what are the consequences of moral choices for other people. And so when Leman finds herself in similar circumstances, going through equally undignified conditions where she thinks her moral integrity is undermined, Selma is both there to remind her of what it means to stay true to your moral commitments, but also to remind her that staying true to your moral commitments requires thinking about your responsibilities to other people as well, so that you don't just find freedom by forgetting about everyone and just doing this liberating act is not just liberating yourself. Liberation is liberating yourself, but in relation to other people as well. So liberating others. And if you can't, then you have to constantly remind yourself that you can't just do the very radical thing that Selma does, because you have to somehow stay true to your obligations to your family, to your husband, to your child. And in fact, what Leman laments about the loss of Selma when she's parted from Selma is the fact that Selma just disappears from her life. Even though she was a role model, she was there. When things didn't go well for Selma, when her integrity was undermined, she forgot that she had this younger girl that she was also responsible for in some ways. And Leman never forgives her for that. She decides that when she's in similar circumstances, when she goes through similar thoughts, when she thinks of, I could do it like Selma, she says, no, but I can't do it like her because she's not taking responsibility for other people. She's only taking responsibility for herself. And ultimately, this looks like it's a moral act, but it's in the end turns out to be a very strange form of selfishness. And this is what she resists up to the end. And so they're very connected. I always think that Selma has the Stoic model of dignity, where the Stoics had this idea that Stoic dignity requires going out of nature and finding freedom in another dimension. And Leman has some features, her conception of dignity, or the one that she embodies, has some analogies, but also is different in this taking responsibility for other people as well. And that's where she departs from Selma. That's where she becomes her own person.
Orada düşündüğüm şu benim, Selma'dan çok etkilendiğim için belki de sürekli onunla ilgili soru sormak istiyorum aslında. Selma'nın başka bir seçim yapma hakkı da yoktu aslında. Seçim şansı yoktu. Orada tam bir bencillik olarak değerlendiremiyorum. Çünkü başka bir şans yoktu gibi geliyor. Çok da spoiler vermek istemiyorum.
Yeah, it's true. But then the question is, there is a part at the very end of the book where Leman is reflecting on her favorite conception of dignity. And it's connected to the one that the German poet Friedrich Schiller writes about. When he writes about dignity, Schiller says that the difference between the human being and the animal is that the animal doesn't decide to suffer. If they're hungry, they eat. If they're struggling, if they're sleepy, they sleep. If they need to have sex, they have sex. They just respond to their instincts. And the difference between an animal and the human is that the human can choose to suffer. And in some ways, I think what Leman, and I don't know which of the two I agree with, but what Leman is reproaching Selma, but that becomes her selfishness in the end, is to say, but why does she not suffer, because when Leman finds herself in a similar position, she also has no choices, but she decides to suffer, and that is the suffering is a choice, and this is where it's difficult, because she reproaches Selma for not making the same choice, and in reproaching her becomes herself selfish, because she reproaches for her own sake. She says, well, she leaves me alone, and now I have to navigate this world, and now I have this model of how people extricate themselves from responsibility. But then on the other hand, I think you're absolutely right, of course, that it is also a vindication of dignity. So which of these is an act of vindicating dignity and which is not something that I resolve in the book. I think it's ambiguous, and the reader is left with this question of there are these different models and these different choices and these different difficulties, and how do people make these choices, and what does that tell us about our own views of dignity, who we empathize with of these characters, and which choices we justify and which ones we don't.
Kitabın zaten bir güzel tarafı da aslında yeniden düşünmemizi sağlayan tarafı da felsefi bakış tarafı. Burada ne haysiyet nedir, ne değildirin karşılığını karakterler üzerinden okumamız da aynı zamanda. Benim galiba en çok takıldığım konu kim bencil, kim haysiyetli, kim haysiyetsiz, kim sorumluluk sahibi, kim sorumluluk sahibi değilin üzerinden hep düşünmek oldu. Burada bir karakter daha var ki çok renkli. Savaş da olsa, faşizm de gelse, komünizm de gelse her şekilde mutlu olan bir karakterimiz var. Koket karakteri, kuzen. Çok eğlenceli. Tamamıyla romanın eğlencesi, neşesi olmuş bence. Gerçek hayattaki fotoğraflarını gördüm sizin. Web'de birkaç yerde vardı böyle birkaç tane fotoğraf. Böyle karakterler tarih kitaplarının anlatmadığı günlük hayatla ilgili bize neler söylüyor? Biraz Koket'te anlatalım istersen.
Yeah, so
çok eğlenceliymiş karar yani, değil mi?
She was absolutely fun, and I remember her as an old woman. I met her when she was about 75 or something, and she would come to our house in Albania, in Durrës, where we grew up. Where I grew up, she was in Tirana, and at the age of 75, put a lot of mascara on and a lot of lipstick, and woke up in the morning, and when they had breakfast with my grandmother, there was nothing to eat, but they would still put out a very white tablecloth with all their best porcelain cups and plates. And there was a whole ceremony of preserving these rituals of their childhood, which they had shared in this world of Ottoman aristocracy, which was completely lost and had been lost for 70 years, 60 years when I met Cocotte. But for 60 years, they kept on to this ritual of living this strange form of evoking dignity and the dignity of manners. And I think Cocotte has, in a way, in the book, she represents a different view of dignity, which is dignity as beauty, as aesthetic. She's not someone, she wakes up in the morning and she likes to change all her dresses and have a lot of makeup and then change her shoes and then goes out and then comes back again and she decides. And the really interesting thing about Cocotte, and I can say this because I also met her as a character and she really was the character that I describe in the book, she didn't do this for anyone. It was not, when she did this at the age of 70, it was not because she thought someone would look at her and think something. It was completely irrelevant to her what the world thought of whether she did it or she didn't. And in fact, in that world, most people didn't care because this was, in particular during communist Albania, a world of scarcity and difficulties. And so it seemed like a form of craziness to pay so much attention to these aesthetic aspects. But for her, and I try to convey this in the very first pages of the book, at some point, Leman, when she meets her, they meet when they're young teenage. Leman is a teenager and Cocotte is just a little bit older. Leman gets really annoyed by this seeming triviality
Sevmiyor
of this
kesinlikle.
character. Seeming sort of just, spending so much time on which creams are the best and which shampoos are the best and reading these magazines and so on. And then at some point, Cocotte decides to show her and take out her, because she realizes that Leman is judging her, And when she wants to explain herself, she just takes out her dress and she shows her that she has no breasts because she's been burnt in the fire of Salonika. And so she has this big, big scar. And her hanging on to this idea of beauty is her hanging on to life. And so that's something that you judge as being superficial and trivial and on the surface shallow. In fact, this is her own personal rebellion and her resistance. And this is how she resists, by hanging on to this ideal of beauty for its own sake, which she doesn't do for anyone, and that she's not doing because she's trying to say something or show something. It's just her own view of what it means to live with a certain conception of the self, regardless of this terrible past that she has. And she vindicates that. And then Leman'ın understands, and that's when they become best friends, because she understands that, in fact, these two are complementary views of human nature, that there is nothing, there is no antagonism. And Cocotte really was like that, and she stayed like that. And when she was in another example from the book, just when communists come to power in Albania, she decides she's put to work in a factory. And so she goes from this world of Ottoman aristocracy and having servants around and bringing the best Chanel perfumes and things from Paris. She loses everything, just like Leman does, and communists come to power. And she's put in some beer making factory. And she wears her Chanel outfits every day to the beer making factory, because this is how she shows that she's not giving up on life and on certain conception of the self. And it's a sort of, I think there is something empowering there in her, in this view, in this form.
Evet, Cocotte'de hep life is too short, yani hayat çok kısa şeklinde devam ediyor ve her saniyesi çok renkli, ama o acıyı da bir tarafta, o acıdan dolayı da bu neşesini kaybetmediğini görüyoruz aslında. Ben çok eğlendim o karakteri okurken.
Yeah, she even has that with falling in love. At some point she writes this letter to Leman and she says, "You've never fallen in love, but I fell in love 5 times yesterday."
Evet, sayılar çok önemli.
And exactly, so, and she says that because she loves life, and it's a sort of general love that she's manifesting. And it's really interesting because she doesn't have, and goes through life with this lightness, with this idea that you actually, it's not a big deal. It's that you carry this trauma, but actually you could have a lighter approach. And I think it's a different way of thinking about living in this world of indignity and resources that you find to cope with it somehow.
Aslında Selma ile Cocotte'i de karşılaştırdığımızda bile birisi kurban oluyor, diğer ise kurban olmayı asla kabul etmiyor ve hayatı seçerek hayata devam eden bir karakter. Böyle de okuyabiliriz bunu. Leman arada.
Yeah, I think so. But don't forget that Cocotte, it all starts because she almost dies in the fire. And so she's made this death experience very early on, and she knows that her life is saved through a miracle. And so she always says, my father says I was saved by miracle, but now I think that I'm living as if I was already dead. And she says, I'm living as if I was already dead, meaning it's as if I understood the meaning of life after death, and now I'm living being given a second chance, and I'm going to make these decisions and make these choices that seem counterintuitive, but I'm going to stick to them, and she manifests that. And I think Selma, she hasn't made the near-death experience. She hasn't confronted death. She confronts it when she chooses to, but she hasn't had this survivor trauma and experience, and in that sense I think this is what makes them different from each other, and this is what conveys their different relationship to life.
Biraz da Aslan'dan, dedeniz, büyük babanızdan konuşmak istiyorum ve biraz da Enver Hoca'dan tabii ki. Enver Hoca meselesi bizim burada da konuşulan bir mesele. Enver Hocacılar var, Enver Hoca karşıtları var, her yerde olduğu gibi. Ama Aslan ilkelerinden vazgeçmeyen bir aydın adeta, aydın daha doğrusu. Babasına gerektiği zaman karşı çıkan, o da güçlü bir karakter. Leman'a göre biraz daha naif bir ruh ama güçlü bir karakter. Benim okuduklarım bunlar. Sizce tarih ilkesiz insanlara daha cömert mi davranıyor? Çünkü Aslan bu aydın olmasının bedelini çok ağır ödüyor.
I think it's because of the particular principles that he has at that point that he pays such a high price. And what I think needs to be said about Aslan is that he's a man, and in that way he represents dignity seen from a male perspective, where the personal and the political are the same thing. So with Leman'ın you have this personal dimension of dignity that is vindicated in some ways against the political world, and it also comes out with the domestic dilemmas, with these tensions about family and marriage and being forced to make certain choices, being seen by society as a woman. In the case of Aslan, the question of dignity is the question of political dignity. The dignity of the person can't be separated from his projects as a political being. And he's a socialist, social democrat. Enver Hoxha represents the revolutionary socialist perspective. So he's a Leninist. When they have this discussion at the very beginning, when they meet, when Leman meets them for the first time together, Enver Hoxha says, what is this obsession, Aslan, that you have with signing contracts all the time, and your adherence to contract and to agreement and to these rules and norms that we all recognize? That can only be done if there is no power structure. But when there is a power structure that is crushing you, you just need to make decisions in this ruthless way. And he conveys this very perspective on politics and on dignity, which explains why he rather than Aslan emerged as victorious from the World War II, because this is the context of the war. The war is, you have no room for nuance. There is no, on the one hand this, on the other hand that. Yes, Aslan says we need socialism, but we need it democratically. Yes, we need political emancipation, but we need it through education, not through intellectuals that tell other people what to do. You need it with a project that involves the people. And so it's a much more, I wouldn't say naive, but it's a project that is more demanding in terms of under what political circumstances can you have this social democratic project? And the war is not one of them. And that's why he finds himself in the war crushed between the communists, the Bolsheviks on the one hand, and the fascists on the other. And he's neither, but he's also lost because he needs to be either one or the other. The war doesn't enable this perspective of a third party. And even when he trusts his British intelligence officer friends, in fact, he makes a mistake because it's because of them that he ends up in prison. So Aslan is a loser because his principles and his view of dignity is presented in a context where there is no room for that conception of dignity. The only conceptions of dignity are the ones that are friend and enemy. You destroy yourself or you will be destroyed. You destroy the enemy or you will be destroyed. So kill or get killed. And Aslan doesn't want to do that. He does not believe in that world. He does not believe in a world where politics is about this radical friend-enemy antagonism. And he's a victim as a result. And I think shows you, in fact, he reflects on that as well, that he goes to prison because of his commitments, because of his commitment to democracy, and pays a high price for exactly those principles that I wouldn't say are the wrong principles, but they are the wrong principles in that context of Albania in the war period, in the Balkans, given the dynamics of nation state and capitalism and war and geopolitical influences. And that's what makes him a paradigmatic victim. And he's, I think, politically one of the characters that I sympathize with in the book, because I feel when I read him and when I thought about him, when I read his works to reconstruct the character, I feel like him now, because I'm reading the news and thinking, well, on the one hand this, on the other hand that, and I want to keep nuance and I want to reject simplification. But you also realize that there are contexts where the world just doesn't let you have that room for nuance and forces you to say, but what is your stance on this particular question and how are you going to get around it? And I could totally see how by being that and over-intellectualizing, you actually lose the political fight. And in some ways, is there also to give this tension between the one who has this vita activa and the vita contemplativa, so the one who keeps sort of going back and forth and thinking about intellectual nuance and culture and politics, and on the other hand, Hoxha, who is much more determined on the goal is to take power. And then we'll figure it out. And he does that, and he does get power. And he even exploits the war dynamic with the British officers and with the Social Democrats and with the fascists to advance his own project because of this ruthless commitment to holding on to power.
Sabiha Kasimati'nin Enver Hoca ile bir söylediği bir söz var ki Enver Hoca zamanında Sabiha'dan hoşlanmış, aralarında bir küçük güzel bir meseleler olmuş. Sabiha şöyle diyor: bütün aydınları öldürürsen devleti kiminle kuracaksın? Aslında bugünümüzün de sorunu bu. Tüm dünyaya baktığımızda. Ne düşünüyorsunuz bu konuda? Yani günümüzde de aynı sorun devam ediyor. Enver Hoca'da da, bugün de, belki yarın da hep aydınlara karşı bir istismar olduğunu düşünüyorum. Ne düşünüyorsunuz?
I would say that there is an important difference because this debate between Hoxha and Kasimati takes place in a moment where there isn't a mass democracy. There isn't a widespread democratic project. So Albania is a country where at the end of the war, only 10% of people at most could read and write. So 90% were illiterate. Women couldn't vote. They voted for the first time in the elections after the war. And so this is not a context of mass political education. And the intellectuals, all these debates between socialists, communists, social democrats, nationalists, liberals, and so on, they all take place within this really restricted 10% elite. I would say that the challenge that we have today is slightly different because we do have mass democracy and we do have access to voting rights. We have levels of instruction and literacy that are much better than anything we have had before. But where I think it becomes a new challenge is in thinking that democracy is just that. So there is the first stage is, of course, to make sure that people have voice. But the second stage, and this is the difficulty that we have now, is to understand that voice is not enough when you have no sophisticated education, when you have just people expressing their preferences, but thinking that all preferences are the same thing and that you're in this realm of opinion. One of the reasons why one of my favorite philosophers, Plato, in his book, The Republic, rejects democracy. He ends up rejecting democracy because he says that democracy is just a rule of opinions and there is no measure of what is an appropriate opinion, what is an informed opinion, what is just an opinion that you say like this, what is just something that you do to express yourself. And I think we are more in that world where we have democracy, but we have democracy understood as the rule of opinions without the mechanisms of education, political or literary or otherwise, that enable us to distinguish between the value of different opinions. And different opinions have different weight depending on the context within which these opinions emerge, how much information people have, how much access they have to resources, how much access to good books, to good films, to good culture. And if you trivialize culture, if you don't pay attention to the quality of information, the quantity risks drowning out the sophistication and ends up just giving you the rule of opinions. So I would say that the challenge is slightly different because the first stage is to have participation, to say we need working classes to vote, we need women to vote, we need everyone to have education, we need the public to be literate, to be able to read and write. But of course, reading and writing is not enough. You also need to read well and write and understand what is being written. And so then you get from the quantity to the question of the quality of opinion formation. And I think in the world in which we live, where opinions are reproduced through clicks and algorithms and surveillance and shares and so on, this discussion is very, very important and is much more alive than it ever was, the question of the quality of democracy. And the fact that when democracy doesn't have this discussion around what kind of opinions, then it ends up falling for these authoritarian characters, or as Plato actually explains in The Republic, he says, look, when he calls the democracy a constitutional bazaar where anything goes, and when anything goes and all the opinions are valid, then people, he says, need this demagogue that comes out and tells people, let me interpret this for you. And this is where I think we are in this moment in politics, where you have the demagogue that goes and says, or the populist leader or the authoritarian leader, or whatever, that says, no, let me explain to people what they really should want, what they really need to. And without the mechanism to resist that, then democracy also collapses.
Kesinlikle. Son olarak sormak istiyorum, uyardılar, bitiyor artık dakikalarımız. Bugün İstanbul'da bu kitabı konuşuyor olmamız benim için çok anlamlı. Bence kitap için de çok anlamlı. Sizce Balkanları anlamadan Türkiye'yi, Türkiye'yi anlamadan Balkanları anlamamız mümkün mü?
Well, I learned a lot about this and had the chance to think about all this while writing the book. And this was one of those cases where my personal memories needed the lens of history and politics to be checked and to understand what I really had heard and what I knew. But on the other hand, where I felt that the family perspective also made me realize that this is not just abstract history, this is not just the history of someone out there. And I would say that the most important bit for me, at least, was to understand how much we in the Balkans, as individual nation states, as Albania, as Greece, as Turkey, how much we are, on the one hand, the victims of a nationalist propaganda that eradicates this shared past and just constructs these myths of what we are now, of the present, as Albanians, as Turks, as Greeks, and so on. And I remember, for example, I had always heard of Mustafa Kemal.
Mm-hmm.
I never knew that Mustafa Kemal was born in Salonika.
Yeah.
And in fact went to see and realized that he was, not only was he born in Salonika where my grandmother was born, but he went to study in Bitola, in Manastir, where my grandfather was born. And so my whole family was sort of, and of course I knew of Mustafa Kemal because I knew he's the founder of modern Turkey, and didn't know anything about this shared Ottoman life and Ottoman past. And this was very important to understand, that through family history and through this shared ancestry, through the individual perspective, you can dig and remove some of these layers of ideology and propaganda that make us read our state's history in a way that is biased. Because if we go to our family history, we understand that this is actually a shared history. And of course, I knew this from my grandmother, but I haven't quite appreciated the extent to which that is the case. And then you go to the state, to the official history, and it's the history of the glory of the nation state. In the case of Albania, the liberation from the Ottoman Empire, in the case of Greece as well. And without thinking about the huge violence that was made to individuals to force this identity, which was not their initial identity on them, this identity of the new nation state, and to force on contemporary citizens this perception of these discrete units that are here and here and here, and they're in conflict with each other, and they have this unresolved conflicts when in fact they all come from the same place. So I think in that sense, for me, it was a very important corrective, because it made me think about how collective identity is manipulated by elites in power, and how important family and histories of individuals are to counter that narrative if you get rid of these ideological lenses through which we read these histories.
Wow. Thank you. Söyleşimiz bu kadar. Benim için çok değerliydi ama şimdi sıra sizde. Sorusu olan varsa Lea sorularınızı yanıtlayacak. Buyurun.
Açık. Öncelikle hoş geldiniz. Sizi burada dinlemek çok keyifli oldu. Ben aslında tarafsızlığınıza dair bir sorum olacaktı. Öncelikle babaannenizin bu fotoğrafını gördüğünüzde ve yorumları incelediğinizde sanki yani kitabın başlangıcında arşive gelmenizin nedeni biraz babaannenizin tabiri caizse haysiyetini kurtarmak amacıylaydı. Sanki söylenenlerin aksine bir şey bulacakmışsınız gibi yola çıkmıştınız. Yani öyle hissettim. Bir de sonuçta bunu gördüğünüzde ya da arşive gitmeye karar verdiğinizde bu kitap fikri var mıydı yok muydu onu bilemiyorum ama sanki arşiv görevlisi size aileden biri misiniz yoksa araştırmacı mısınız diye o soruyu sormasaydı yine de bir araştırmacı olarak mı orada devam edecektiniz? Yani bu soru mu size bu kararı vermek zorunda bıraktırdı diye sormak istiyorum aslında. Yani Tiran'a gelene kadar sanki böyle bir amacınız yoktu da burada taksicinin işte diğer güvenlik görevlilerin ya da arşiv görevlilerinin bu baskısı altında kaldığınız için mi, psikolojik baskısı altında kaldığınız için mi böyle bir karar vermek zorunda kaldınız? Teşekkürler.
Thank you. I would say the pressure was for me already in advance because I went to the archive thinking that I'm going to confront this unknown. And the unknown could be something also very unpleasant for me. So in some ways, I had decided that I wanted to confront the archive with a bit of a distance, not as a family member only. And this is when I had applied. I had already applied as a researcher. And that was a decision that I had taken before going to Albania, because I applied when I was in the UK. But what I now think is that I went to the archive with a lot of trust in the archive. So I went with a lot of faith that I would find the truth about my grandmother in the archive. And I soon discovered that very soon, as soon as I saw these first documents that were coming, that there is only a truth to find if you can trust the authority that has constructed the truth for you. And this is what archives are. They are authorities that build facts. They select them in a certain way. They decide to put them together. They combine them in this. They construct the files. They select the information in a way that keeps certain things and rules out certain other things. It's like when you're doing a scientific experiment, you have to make these inferences and you take some material and you leave some. And I realized very quickly that what I thought was the truth was actually someone's perspective. And in fact, I went there thinking that this is where the truth is, and realized, no, this could be the creation of a spy, someone who decides to report something because they need a promotion, or not to report something because they fall in love with the victim. And all of this meant that this place, which I thought was a repository of truth, in fact was a kind of aesthetic creation of someone or other. In Albania, it was the communist spies. In Greece, it was the nationalist archives. I went there asking for the Ottoman Empire, and people would say, no, we don't have anything about the Ottoman Empire. It's all Greek nation states. This is from that period. If you want the Ottoman Empire, go to the Kadast. And then you go to the Cadastre, and I said, no, but you have to go to Istanbul, because that's where And of course, in the actual empire, all of these places were imperial centers. But now that history is consolidated, it's consolidated from the point of view of the nation state. So all of that made me realize that there is this aesthetic of the archive where you go thinking you find the truth, and actually you're finding someone's creation. And this is what made me decide to write my book with this more literary part, because I thought this is a creation, but it's a creation with an aim to be sincere about what the archive doesn't contain. And so maybe there is more truth to the author, to the fiction writer, that lies or fictionalizes and says, but I'm fictionalizing because of what the archive doesn't say, than to this archive that tells you I am the truth, but actually it's someone's lie. And this is where these perspectives became really important for me.
Lea, përshëndetje. Fillimisht dua të falenderoj dhe të them që ndihemi krenar që kemi një person si ju këtu. Do ta bëj pyetjen, por do e bëj në turqisht që ta kuptojnë edhe tjerë.
Yeah. You can translate it to Turkish.
English please.
Ben de Arnavutluk'un için öncelikle ona teşekkür etmek istedim. Böyle bir şahsiyete sahip olduğumuz için bu zamanda. Sorum şu şekilde olacak. İnsan sürekli bir sistemin içerisinde olmuştur. Bu sistemler olmaya devam edecektir. Öncekilerden monarki olsun, sonra komünizm olsun, bugün demokrasi. Her sistemin eksikliği veya artısı vardır, fakat acısını çeken insandır. Ve siz bu konuda nasıl bir öğreniniz var? Yani nasıl bir sistemde olmamız gerekiyor? Az önce belirttiğiniz gibi mesela insan kendisini eğitirse, yani kendisini geliştirirse o zaman sisteme dahil bir şekilde olabilir, ama sistemi değiştirebilir mi? Bu konuda sizin öneriniz nedir? Teşekkür ederim.
Thank you. Well, this is a very difficult question of progress in history. And this is what my favorite philosopher, Immanuel Kant, he has an essay where he asks this question, do human beings make progress in history? And he says there are several ways of thinking about it. One of them is that there is just cyclical. You make some progress and then you return to regress. And he calls this the terroristic view of history, because it's not, you can't hold it in one thought that we make. It's not for us, for our meaning making. It's not possible to think that we make progress, but then we go back to exactly where we were. And what follows from this in terms of political systems is this idea that if you don't want to think of history as just cyclical and returning us to these previous periods, which is not a very productive thought, and it's also this terroristic view of history, as Kant calls it, then you have to think of progress as something incremental. Now, I don't think this incremental thing means that there is progress from one age to the other. I think it's made of lapses, but where you can still articulate what does progress mean by thinking about the errors of the past and what learning you can do from them, what we can learn from the tragedies of the past. So it's not a story of progress that says, look at all these great things that have been done and how much better human beings are. This is a Steven Pinker take on progress. You know, look at how much better human beings are now compared to the Middle Ages, where they suffered from teeth problem and died and so on. It's not that. It's more, it's a conception of progress that is more tragic in a way. It's more sad, more pessimistic, but which still holds on to this idea of morality and dignity as something that we have, that we can't completely get rid of, however hard we try, however much people in power try to convince us to get rid of. And with this conception of dignity, you can then read historical events and think about what can we learn from these cases of indignity in the past. Mm-hmm. What can we learn from, for example, seeing how history repeats itself in the present, how we have gone back to these dynamics of manipulating identity and appropriating the human by these different political projects. Can this bring into something a bit better? Now, I don't think it's important, because to answer your question, and why it's the question of progress, because on the one hand, there is no guarantee that we do the right thing. We do the right thing if we decide to do the right thing. We don't do it if we decide to not learn anything from history. And because we have freedom and we have free will, we can choose to do the wrong thing. It's not that there's anything in the human that makes them do always the better thing or always the right thing. There's a part of us that does the wrong thing and a part of us that does the right thing. The question is, what do these systems learn from each other, and how can one avoid the mistakes of the past, and how can one use this moral learning, this moral knowledge that we build from the past to confront the challenges of the present? And so when I say, for example, education, to me it seems very obvious that the world in which we live, education that is privatized, that is in the hands of very few people and not widely accessible and not free, and where events are not there is such a high cost on culture, it's very obvious that leads to citizens that are unable to then be democratic participants in their collective decisions. There's a clear loss to our capacity for decision making. It's very clear to me that nationalism, for example, comes at a cost for humanity. That you have these views of my nation state and my country first, make America great again, or make Turkey great again, or make Albania great again. It's very clear to me that if all of us try to make ourselves great again here in this room, there's not enough room for everyone. Because at some point you can't live with this, consistently with this. So it seems to me that these lessons that we have from the past, we can use in the present, and we can deploy them to reflect critically about the world in which we live. And although this doesn't give you a blueprint for how the perfect society looks like, it does give you a platform or a project or a mission for what you need to do, what you need to criticize, and what you need to go against in the present. And it is necessary to have the hope that this can work, because otherwise you give up and you don't fight. And that's where this question of dignity and morality in the end is connected to what do you need to believe about the human, and why is literature so important, so that you can hold on to that belief, so that you can then generate this project of emancipation and this fight that you need to keep going.
Süper. Buyur. Ya sorry.
Teşekkürler Melike Şahiner. Sizi burada görmek gerçekten çok heyecan verici. Biz sizin Özgür kitabınızı bir kitap kulübünde sevgili Güzün'ün sayesinde okuduk. Size de kitaba da aşık olduk. Sonra tabii hemen arkasından çıkar çıkmaz da Indignity'yi okuduk. Gerçekten olağanüstüydü. Çok büyük olasılıkla babaannelerimiz ya komşuydu, Selanik'te, Manastır'da bir yerlerde. Bu da belki bizi çok etkiledi. Benim sorum şöyle, bu iki kitabı, siz aslında bir akademisyensiniz. Evet, kitaplarda işlediğiniz konuyu anlıyorum. Sizin konunuzdan gelen yanları var. Ama bu kitapları yazmaya nasıl karar verdiniz? Kendi kişisel hikayenizi akademisyenliğinizle mi birleştirdiniz? Ya da akademideki bilgi artık size bunu anlatma hissi mi verdi? Ben buradaki o özel meseleyi merak ediyorum açıkçası. Teşekkür ederim.
Yeah, I think, well, all good things sometimes, well, a lot of good things sometimes happen by chance. And I think I stumbled on this method of trying to combine the macro and the micro when I had started the first book, Free, which was supposed to be an academic book about liberalism and socialism and this kind of different philosophies of freedom and these different traditions. And it was going to be like all the books that I usually write, or I had written up to that point, which were academic books. But the good thing that happened to me, though it wasn't good for the world, was COVID. And I was in Germany doing research for this academic book, and there was lockdown, and so the conferences were suspended, the libraries were closed. I had nothing else to do, and I was writing from, I was in Berlin doing research, and my kids were at that point 2 at nursery and 1 very small in school, were running around, and I was hiding in a cupboard in Berlin to try and write this book, which was a big cupboard because it was a German cupboard, but it was still a cupboard. And I was in this cupboard thinking about sometimes in our lives, there are these moments where the big philosophical idea of freedom and the small experience of living in a cupboard and writing about freedom in the cupboard are part of the same conversation. And it also occurred to me when I was writing this book about freedom and thought, this is so weird. Like, I'm writing about freedom from Kant to Marx to Hegel to whatever, and I'm writing it from a cupboard in Berlin, one of the capitals of Western Europe, where, you know, we are supposed to have get freedom. And it occurred to me that there had been another time in my life when I was going through this transition from socialism to capitalism in Albania in the 90s, where it had felt the same thing, where the discussion on the street and the discussion at home was part of the same conversation. There was this macro conversation around freedom, and there was this micro experience. And I decided that instead of writing the academic book about liberal and socialism and their different views of freedom, I would write by using the micro as a lens into the macro. And so I would use this life of this girl who grows up in communist Albania and is asking herself these questions about freedom, and as a coming-of-age story of a little girl, but through the coming-of-age story of the girl, I would also write the coming-of-age story of the country and of the macro systemic shifts that the country experiences. And this, I found, was a very productive way of thinking about freedom, because it made me think about the nuances, the ambiguities, the loss, the cost to the individual that comes from endorsing certain conceptions. And I found that it was a very important corrective to the sensibilities of the time, that we are able to tell these stories not just as abstract stories of states and countries and political systems and ideologies, but also as just these lives that get caught up in history. And so when I found this method, it was like the apple that falls on the head of Newton. I decided that all my other books were going to be about exploring universal ideas and philosophical concepts through character and plot and detail, and so with the tools of literature. And that's why Indignity does that with dignity. My new book, my next book, which is going to be about equality, does it with equality. And then I have another, so I have like a whole human comedy with concepts that could be experienced through the point of view of characters.
Thank you. Buyurun. Herkes.
Ben de geldiğiniz için çok mutluyum. Teşekkür ediyorum bizim burada zaman ayırdığınız için. Ben özellikle ikinci kitapta, Özgür'den sonraki kitapta Indignity, Haysiyetsizlik'te belgesel roman, biyografi değil de belgesel roman derdim. Peter Weiss'ın Direnmenin Estetiği kitabına çok benzettim. Orada haysiyeti estetik aracılığıyla arıyor, Direnmenin Estetiğinde. Sizin de estetikle ilgilendiğinizi biliyorum. Bununla ilgili dersleriniz var. Bir sonraki kitapta estetik ve direnmeyi ya da haysiyeti birleştirmeyi düşünüyor musunuz?
Good question.
Thank you. Well, I think in a way I try to do that with all my books, and in particular in Indignity, that is quite explicitly a dimension of the book that is very important. As you know, the book starts with these two epigraphs. One is the Kant one that says, "In the kingdom of ends, everything has either a price or a dignity." And the other epigraph is a quotation from Schiller that says, "It's not just a philosophical, rhetorical move to call beauty our second creator." And he writes this in the Letters for the Aesthetic Education of Humanity, because he was in this debate with Kant on Kant holding on to these moral ideals, and Schiller saying, but you need the dimension of feelings, of passions, you need aesthetic education to make people realize what these moral ideals are about. And he thought that that's what the work of art does, and that's why he thought that, you know, the artists would save the world and would give us this perspective on the imagination and on hope. And so this discussion around the relationship between aesthetic and ethic is very much present in Indignity. It's, I think, also very much present in the method of Indignity, in the choice to move from non-fiction to fiction. So in non-fiction, in the documentary parts, in the archive parts, in the discussion around historical memory and sources and so on, that's a more abstract analysis of what happens to moral ideals in political situations, in political institutions. But in the novel part, in the fictionalized part, you have the aesthetic that tries to fight back. And so you have the work of the imagination and the work of thinking about characters with these different ideas of dignity and the tensions between them and the plot. And I hope that I will be able to do that. And I think good novels are always in this conversation between the aesthetic and the ethic.
Okay. Çok teşekkür ediyoruz. Süremizin maalesef sonuna geldik. Söyleşiden sonra. Katıldığınız için çok çok teşekkür ediyoruz. Thank you for.
Thank you.